So that was a little reel I put together and edited using the Dehancer Pro plugin. Now, I've had my eye on getting this plugin for a while, so when Dehancer reached out and asked if I wanted to review the product, I absolutely jumped at the opportunity to do so. The Dehancer team has provided me with a 1-month license in order to create this review and tutorial, but this is not a paid sponsorship in any way, and all of the thoughts and ideas I'm getting ready to share with you about the product are 100% my own. They actually requested a fully honest review so that they can best improve their product based on real thoughts from real users. So, shout out to Dehancer for that. That being said, while I do have some mixed feelings about a few specific elements within the software, overall I was pretty blown away by Dehancer's capabilities to grade and edit digital footage. It's an amazing tool if you know what you're doing, which is key. But if you don't, hopefully this video can help you out a bit, because I truly do believe that Dehancer can be a very valuable tool while you're editing. Okay, cool. So what actually even is Dehancer Pro? Well, Dehancer is a professional film emulation plugin, which is just a fancy way of saying it's a post-production tool that allows your digital videos to have the characteristics of being shot on traditional film stock. And trust me, it's a bit more complex than just slapping some grain on top of your footage, but don't worry, we'll dive into all of that. Now, if you aren't looking to get the full version of the plugin, there is still a light version that does contain a lot of very valuable tools. And you can't sleep on their iOS app that allows you to edit both photos and videos straight from your smartphone. Super clutch for any on-the-go situations, or if you just prefer to edit on your phone. If you end up wanting to purchase any of Dehancer's products, make sure to use my code BREAKiNGBANKS for a nice little discount. So after you've downloaded Dehancer, you'll see that it's just a basic Mac install package. You'll simply double-click, close out of your editing software if it's already open, and when you reopen the software, you'll be able to find Dehancer within your effects window. I should quickly mention that available on Dehancer's website are their quick guide manuals that give even more detail and insight into exactly what each specific parameter does. Now, if you're planning on getting the plugin, I highly recommend downloading these manuals and having them handy to reference as you learn the plugin. So you can either drag Dehancer directly onto your clip or onto an adjustment layer right above your clip, which is suggested by Dehancer and also just a personal preference of mine. But of course, whatever you feel most comfortable with is how you should proceed. Now, you might see a watermark on top of your footage, even if you have purchased the full version of the plugin, but don't panic. Simply scroll down to the tab that says license info, and in there, you'll be able to input your activation code and remove the watermark. At the top of your Dehancer panel, you'll see the input tab, which will contain a bunch of different source options that you can choose from. I've found that sticking with Rec. 709 works best for me, since that's what I usually shoot in, but of course here you can experiment and even find your exact camera specs to work off of. You can also mess with the temperature and tint here, as well as the defringe setting, which can help deal with any chromatic aberration. Underneath input, you'll see the film tab, which contains one of, if not the most important element in your entire Dehancer world, film stocks. Now, this is really where the sauce gets its flavor from, the heart and soul of the plugin. There's over 60 different film stocks you can choose from, so I definitely suggest going through them all and seeing what you gravitate towards. Of course, you can also push or pull the film depending on what you want to see, and if there's a TV show or movie whose look you want to emulate, look up what stock they use and you'll be able to find it within Dehancer's catalog. I mean, it's insanely versatile and holds a very authentic look. Moving on to the next three sections, film developer, film compression, and expand, all of which are pretty straightforward if you have some basic editing background. I find the film compression tool to be quite helpful, as its parameters give you a lot of control over the image. Dehancer describes it as a tool that lets you fine-tune the distribution of highlights, making the image more flexible to manipulate exposure, contrast, and a whole lot more as we continue editing. A lot of film stocks and profiles lack major contrast due to the need to preserve the natural elements of the film stocks or profiles themselves. Therefore, it becomes super important to do a bit of tinkering to bring that contrast back to the image. If that's the case, the expand tool is useful for shifting your black and white points to get them exactly where you want them to be. You should definitely play around with this parameter throughout your edit to ensure that your vision is getting realized. For a more in-depth breakdown on these three sections, I highly suggest checking out the articles on them from the official Dehancer website, which I've conveniently linked in the bio for you. Now down to the print parameter, which quite honestly I find incredibly valuable, as it gives you the power to create your own unique looks by crafting different combinations of film stocks that we touched on earlier and print profiles. Well, think of them as the paper in which the film stock gets printed on in order to create a deliverable format. Each print has its own set of characteristics that make it unique, as you can see here. Now, there are recommendations by Dehancer for what profile you should use based on what film stock you chose, but of course, feel free to get creative and find what works best for you. Once you've made a choice on your print, you can adjust the parameter even further by using the sliders underneath. Fine-tune the white balance in your image by adjusting the target white slider. Adjusting the exposure slider will allow you to change the brightness of the print itself, not the actual image. The tonal contrast slider, of course, allows you to adjust the contrast of your print image. Color density, a bit confusing, but it allows you to add saturation specifically to the aesthetically pleasing colors in your image. Dehancer says that this tool can be used to mitigate oversaturated accents or emphasize any meaningful colors without having to do any masking. If you need to bring the global saturation down, you can do so using the saturation parameter. But just to note that you can only lower the saturation, not increase. And lastly, with the analog range limiter enabled, you'll have a softer image with improved detail at the edges of the tonal range in both the deep shadows and the bright highlights. I usually leave this on, but to sound like a broken record, it's about finding the look that you want to achieve. All right, so color head. It's as if you change the color of the main light source shining on your image during exposure of the print itself. Now, using these little sliders at the bottom, you can adjust the way it affects your shadows, midtones, and highlights. The preserve exposure setting will, well, do exactly that. It'll rectify any major changes in exposure that occurred during the shifting of any of the aforementioned parameters. And impact is basically the opacity slider, just how strong or not strong you want this effect to be on your image. All right, so let's get funky and dive into the next set of tools that cover the natural characteristics of shooting on film. I'm gonna leave film grain till the end for two specific reasons. The first is that it's insanely heavy on my tiny little processing system on my laptop, and it starts to breathe like it had a long day. And secondly, and more importantly, I've always just seen film grain as a finishing touch or, the garnish on top of a dish. And so for those reasons, we're just gonna wait until we get everything else out of the way to tackle film grain. So all of the parameters in this section actually have presets that you can choose from, which is super handy, especially when you're first starting out. But you also do have the opportunity to customize them to your precise liking as well. For the sake of not having too long of a video, I'll explain what each tool is and does, and hopefully that'll give enough insight for you to start diving in and finding your look. And if you want me to do a deeper dive into any of these parameters, definitely let me know in the comments and I'd be happy to do so. So that brings us to halation, described by Dehancer as a visual effect that appears as a red-orange halo near the contrasting boundaries of overexposed areas when shooting on film. Halation is usually produced around bright light sources. Now there's some great presets you can choose from, as well as of course being able to customize it to your own liking. The mask mode parameter allows you to isolate the images in your area that are or will be affected by halation. The bloom effect refers to the scattering of bright light at the edges of contrasting areas in your image. It's most noticeable when shooting on special lenses, vintage lenses, or any type of optical filters. Film damage is exactly that. You see, when shooting on film and doing the subsequent steps of processing, storing, duplicating, and displaying it, different effects like dust, hair, scratches, and other damage will inevitably appear. So in order to emulate the look of shooting on authentic film, film damage is another tool inside of your toolbox. Film breath is the accidental change in color, exposure, or contrast from frame to frame as the film moves. Gate weave is that little dance that you see your image do as it passes through an old projector or a frame window in a camera. Now this is just another parameter to play with to capture that authentic vintage look. Next is the overscan parameter. Now this parameter gives you those cinematic borders that we often see with footage shot on traditional film stock. I just want to say that Dehancer has done an amazing job with crafting this tool, amongst others as well, but I really love this tool. I use it almost every time I use the plugin. It's just super authentic looking and really adds a whole lot to your image. So I love it and I hope you do as well. The vignette tool is the same as it would be anywhere else, simply just a darker border at the periphery of your frame. So use at your own discretion to achieve the look you want. And of course, I can never forget about our garnish, so let's dive into it now. Film grain. I really love the fact that Dehancer's algorithm generates the grain based on characteristics of the local image, so it feels as if it's actually built into your footage instead of just being slapped on top. There's two different types of grain you can decide between, negative or positive. Negative grain is going to be more pronounced in your highlights with a higher micro contrast, while positive grain is a lot more traditional in its production of a softer grain and is a lot less loud in the highlights. All that being said, play around with it and find what you like. If you have the processing power, which I don't, but I still do it, then you should leave analog enabled, because while it may tax your computer a bit, it does give you the best and most authentic look. The following film grain parameters are all pretty self-explanatory, so I'll sprint through these. Size, how big or small your grain is. Higher number, bigger grain. Lower number, smaller grain. Amount, how much grain is actually present in the image. Film resolution is where you'll decide how sharp or not sharp you want your clip to be. The next three really offer you a great amount of control, allowing you to modify the intensity of the grain within your image, specifically of course in the midtones, shadows, and highlights. And the last parameter here is chroma, which determines how colorful or dyed your grain will be. And remember to head back to the expand parameter to do any final contrast tweaks you might need after having applied all of your tools. All right, well, that's gonna do it for me, y'all. I appreciate you watching. Definitely don't be afraid to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions or if there's anything you want to see me do a video on, please drop a comment and I'd be happy to do so. So remember to use my code BREAKiNGBANKS for a discount on the Dehancer Pro plugin. Thanks again, and as we say on set, I'll see you on the next one. Take care.